Hello everybody. Uh, we're going to pick up with this video. I'm going to make this one a little bit longer than previous ones were. I've been trying to keep that 15 to 20 minute range, but it's taken so long to upload them into YouTube that it's just taken too much time. So I'm going to make a little bit longer video, and in the description I'll put where the different sections start at from a time standpoint, so you can just jump from point to point to find the different areas that you might be strong or weak in. So we left off last video with pesticide use, which was part of the Green Revolution and allowed us to increase our yields. Now we're going to look at genetic engineering and how that worked. The first way that genetic engineering worked, and again, when we look at genetic engineering, we're looking at GMOs, those genetically modified organisms, as our output. We're genetically modifying crops to be drought resistant, pest resistant, to grow in ways that we never were able to grow before. We're adding nutritional value to food, all those different things. So one of the things they've helped us do is to get greater yield. And we've increased greater yields by adding pesticide resistance, we've added drought resistance, we have drought tolerant crops now, and we've also allowed them to grow bigger and faster. This one here helped out a lot, because now if we can take an organism that normally would take, say, a year to get from birth to harvestable size, now we're getting it to where a plant maybe might sprout one day and then be able to harvest within a few months, as opposed to within 6, 8, 10 months. So they're allowed to grow bigger, faster. These are all things that we're able to increase our yield. Adding pest resistance didn't necessarily cause more plants to grow, but we lost less due to pest damage. Drought tolerant, now we were able to increase our yields because we were able to grow in areas that we never were able to grow before. We were able to increase food quality because we were able to add nutritional value to it. For instance, golden rice is always the one that I always turn to. With golden rice, they took rice and crossed it with a gene from a daffodil. They inserted that gene from a daffodil because it produced beta carotene. The beta carotene then converts into vitamin A in the human body. So now we had a vitamin enriched rice. They hadn't let it be released out into the world yet to be large scale agriculturally produced due to the fears of genetic modification and all of that stuff. Hopefully one day they'll be able to release that, and that is going to go a long way to reducing malnutrition problems worldwide. We had a reduction in pesticide use because now we can have organisms naturally produce pest resistance. So they may produce, for instance, like BT corn. It produces Bacillus thuringiensis, so that now we have less crop loss because it's naturally producing that pesticide. Now we don't have to apply pesticide to the crop, it's naturally producing it. So forget what I was writing here, but we'll put natural production of pesticides in some cases. And with this, it's important to look at it because even if we don't reduce the pesticide usage, we've made plants resistant to glyphosate, for instance. Glyphosate is a much less toxic pesticide than what we were using in the past. We used to use atrazine before, and atrazine was an extremely toxic pesticide. It killed beneficial and harmful alike and just destroyed all life that came in contact with it. By using the glyphosate, we can see that the toxicity of glyphosate is similar to that of like caffeine, for instance. So, we drink caffeine in coffee without even thinking about it, or within soda without even thinking about it. When we apply that glyphosate, it's a much less toxic version of the pesticide. So even if we don't reduce the amount we're using safer varieties of it. We've reduced world hunger, we've increased profits, all those different things. That's why genetic engineering was so important. But people inherently are scared when we start changing up the genetics of these crops because they think it's playing God, they think it's unnatural. We may cause, they think they're out there that we may cause allergens if we're crossing, say, shellfish with corn, for instance. People that have shellfish allergy, they're afraid then that they're going to have an allergy to corn then. That's not the case because you're taking out a specific gene, not necessarily the gene that's going to cause that histamine reaction that causes the allergic reaction to it. Instead, they're taking out the gene that might give it hardier temperature resistance, where it's able to grow in colder temperatures. So right now, according to the science only, they're safe for human consumption. There's no scientific evidence that genetic modification is bad for humans from a health standpoint. There's concerns about effect on biodiversity. They were afraid as we made these drought tolerant and pest tolerant crops that we were going to create super weeds and harm uh, pollinators, for instance. What they found was the pollinators weren't really being harmed from it. They were finding alternative things to get their nectar from. Uh, Now we do have super weeds coming about because we're exposing them to pesticides and things like that. They're cross-pollinating with some of those pesticide-resistant crops, and it's creating pesticide-resistant weeds. So this one isn't necessarily unfounded, but the safety for human consumption, that one is an unfounded relationship that's made. Now, when we look outside of the Green Revolution, that sums up the Green Revolution. Hopefully, you guys understand all parts of that. When we look at the other portion of our diet, the Green Revolution dealt primarily with grain production and vegetable production. Now we're looking at the protein that we're producing, the meat that we're eating. Most of the meat we eat is coming from concentrated animal feed operations. These are just huge concentrated areas that we have lots of cows, lots of pigs, or lots of chickens. So we're looking at our big three: beef, chicken, and pork. So beef, poultry, and pork. When we look at these big three, that's where a lot of our protein sources come from in the developed world, because again, we can afford to go out and buy those. It doesn't make sense to raise these animals anymore, free range or in other ways, because when we look at them, it's one of those things where we want to get them to harvestable size as quick as we can. By using these concentrated animal feed operations, we're able to get them to harvestable size very, very quickly. And when we look at that, again, what used to take us maybe 6 months to get a chicken from birth to harvestable size, now we're accomplishing it in 30, 40 days. Again, I'm not sure of those numbers. I'm just making up things to put it in perspective. So what they do in these concentrated animal feed operations is they put all of these animals in a confined space and they just keep on feeding them over and over and over again. One of the problems with that is as you're feeding them, they're in direct contact with one another. So we have big problems with disease being spread and parasites being spread because again, they're such close contact, they're standing in each other's feces. So those diseases are spreading very quickly. The other thing is just the sheer amount of waste that's produced. So we have for every pound of meat, again, I'm making up numbers, we could have an equal amount of waste being produced. So it's just a huge quantity of waste because we're feeding them so much, they're constantly defecating and pooping, and we're producing huge quantities of manure. That manure has to be dealt with because if we just let it pile up and it rained and the wash water from that waste then finds its way into the river systems or the streams nearby, we could have eutrophication problems. If it sinks down into the ground, we can have contamination of groundwater. So we have to look at that waste, and we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. But waste is one of the big, big problems with these concentrated animal feed operations. When we look at fish production, we're looking at harvesting fish within fisheries. Those are commercially harvestable populations of fish, and they're in a particular region. When we look at the ocean itself, it itself is not the fishery. Where there's a concentrated pocket of fish in the ocean, those are the fisheries. So we might have in a lake, for instance, three different fisheries within a large lake. We can go here and we can expect that there's going to be a higher than normal chance to catch fish here. So it makes sense from an economic standpoint to target your efforts fishing here as opposed to out here where we don't know for sure there's going to be fish. So when we look at that, by targeting these specific fisheries, we're over harvesting the fish from them. When we overharvest the fish and we get to a 90% or more reduction in fish population, then that fishery is said to have collapsed. If it gets to be too problematic, then the fishery completely collapses and we lose that species in that area. Another big problem with fisheries, not only overfishing, but we end up with bycatch associated with them. That's where we're catching fish unintended. We're fishing for tuna, but in the tuna nets, we're ending up with dolphins and turtles and sharks and things like that. So they're non-targeted species that we catch. And again, it's not that we're trying to catch them, we just happen to be catching them. The problem with it is most of the time that bycatch dies because it's either crushed by the sheer weight of the fish in the nets as they're dragging them up on deck, or they're attached to the long lines, they end up drowning or get so weak that they end up dying from it. At one time, I looked at the statistics for it, and it was basically a 1-to-1 ratio, where for every pound of fish we catch, of the targeted species, we're catching 1 pound of bycatch. So it's a huge problem for us because if you think about it, uh, that bycatch a lot of times we might not be able to sell it off for a profit and have it be economically sound to harvest it, but that bycatch is supporting food chains and food webs. If we keep catching that bycatch at exponential rates, now we're starting to affect the food chains, food webs, and we start seeing more and more fisheries collapse because they're not having those thriving food chains. So we need to be very careful with the bycatch and find ways to reduce the amount that we're actually catching. And when we look at it, this would be a fishery. Again, it's a concentrated variety of fish. It's an area of a body of water that has an economically sound harvestable population where we can make a profit by harvesting it. And when we look at it, our global fish production has stagnated where we're not really producing that much fish anymore. But the good news for us is we're turning to an alternative method. We're not catching as much wild caught fish as we used to. Instead, again, we have a fairly steady, consistent rate of fish production where we're selling off fish in the grocery stores and the markets, things like that. But more and more of those fish are coming from aquaculture, which is fish farming. And fish farming reduces that impact on the wild caught populations. Anytime we can reduce the impact on the wild caught populations, we're helping the ocean to kind of replenish itself. When we look at it in terms of bycatch, again, this would be a commercial fishing method. You can see the majority of the fish are that targeted species they're trying to catch. But in those nets, there might be sea turtles mixed in. Those sea turtles get tangled up in the nets. If the nets are able to sit out there, the sea turtles then drown. If it was an alternative fishing method where they were using long lining, for instance, a seabird might see the baited hook and think, oh, there's a piece of fish down there, swoop down, grab the piece of fish, but on its way back up, hooks itself in its beak, and it can't get loose. Once it gets too tired to stay above the water, it starts to drown from there. So the bycatch is a big, big problem. Sorry, went too fast here. Let me go backwards a slide. And again, this would be some more bycatch. Here, sorry, here we might be trying to target prawns, for instance. Those prawns are in here, but we're also catching skates and starfish and little fish that we're not intended to catch. And we can see crabs in here as well. So we're going to take the ones that we're trying to harvest and trying to capture. The rest of it just gets pitched overboard. And the ones that are pitched overboard usually are dead or will be dead very soon. And here you can see that it's a dolphin that happens to be part of the bycatch. When it starts to get to be dolphins, that's where people start taking notice of it. They don't really care that you're catching starfish and skates and things like that. But when they start killing off dolphins, that's where people start raising up and resisting against it. They're saying, why are we doing this? Why don't we find better ways to do it? And they have found better ways to reduce bycatch. And when we talk about these fishing methods, we'll get into those. First fishing method that we have, again, all these are going to be commercial methods of fish harvesting. First one is going to be trawler fishing, and you can see they're dragging a weighted net. This is a heavy weight to make it drag along the bottom. It's catching everything in its path. And if you look, the plants at the bottom of the ocean are also being torn up because this is acting like a bulldozer that's going to clear cut the ocean bottom. So behind here, there would be a path of devastation that's basically just a big strip of mud left over after the net drags over it. When they bring that net up onto the ship, then they're going to unload the fish that they were intending to catch. Let's say that they were trying to catch these squid here, for instance. Those squids are going to be kept. The rest of the fish just gets pitched overboard. But you can tell by them dragging it through, the fish get jammed up down here at the back, and it starts to put more and more pressure on them. As it puts more and more pressure on them, they're starting to get squished to death. So most of that bycatch that they pitch overboard is either dead or about to be dead. Second method is gill netting, and gill netting is a pretty problematic thing from a bycatch standpoint as well. They put these nets out in the ocean that have holes in them big enough for the heads of the fish to go in, but by the time it gets to their dorsal fin and their pectoral fins, the pectoral and dorsal fins can't make it through. So the fish hits that, gets snagged up, it says, oh my gosh, I need to get out of here. It tries to turn and back up. It can't turn and back up. Instead, its gills get caught up in the net, and it ends up killing off the fish. These nets are huge. They could be several miles long out in the open ocean where they're doing this. If it's in near the shore, they're not going to be that long, but they're still going to be, a few hundred yards long. They're purposely targeting where the fish migration routes are and the fish travel through those areas. That way they know for sure that they're going to have a higher amount of the fish they're trying to catch. But again, if a sea turtle happens to swim through, it gets tangled up. These nets are made of material that you can't see once it's suspended in the water. It kind of becomes invisible to the fish. We may be able to see it, but the fish can't tell that it's there. Purse seining, this is one of the more common methods. And with purse seining, a lot of times they actually do a two-tiered approach. They'll have the ship that's doing the fishing, and they'll have spotter vessels around, whether those spotter vessels are airplanes, helicopters, or other boats. The spotter vessels are looking for concentrations of fish. Down here, they found one of those concentrations. So they'll radio to the boat. They'll tell them, hey, circle around that fish and drop your net. As they're dropping their net, they're surrounding the fish with the net. They then pull the net in from the bottom, sealing it off so the fish can't get out. Then they drag the net onto the boat, and all the fish are caught then. But the problem is, if there happens to be other fish in that school or nearby that school, they're also getting captured. This is the one type of fishing, though, that they can reduce bycatch, because they do this with tuna fishing a lot. They'll actually have divers go down before they drag the net on board, and the divers will cut holes into the net to allow the tuna. Sorry, they'll cut holes into the net to allow the non-tuna fish to get out. Say that there's sharks or dolphins in there. They'll cut a hole in, the dolphin or shark will swim out, and then they'll latch up the hole again. Then after all the bycatch is removed, they'll bring them up to the surface and harvest the tuna population. The other big problem with purse seining is the spotter planes and spotter vessels oftentimes use sonar, and the sonar disrupts whale migration routes, for instance, because the sound waves start to bounce through the ocean and it disorients the fish. So again, the sonar that they use tends to be very problematic as well. Long lining, again, another really bad one. These lines, they found lines that were, tens of miles of long lines. And every 5 or 6 feet, there's a baited hook. Those baited hooks are non-discriminatory. Anything that wants to go up and eat that bait is going to get caught by them, whether it's a sea turtle, whether it's a targeted species, or whether it's just a smaller fish that just happens by and sees a free, easy meal, or a bird that swoops down and finds the ones that are close to the surface. If it's a 10-mile long net, a 10-mile long line, it's going to be awfully hard for that ship to drag that line in. It's going to take them, several hours, maybe 10, 12, even 24 hours to haul these lines in and cast those lines. So the fish that get caught, most of the time they die by the time that they actually bring them on the boat because they've been weakened to the point where they just run out of energy and end up dying from it. The best method to use, pole and line fishing. And the reason why it's the best method, you're targeting a specific fish. If you catch a fish on your pole and line that's not your targeted species, you can easily take it off the hook, throw it back in. By doing that, you're not killing that species. You see this with shows like the Outer Banks tuna fishing show and those types of things. This is more what you would do in a local pond or a local lake. But when we're talking commercially, they still do this practice commercially, but they tend to target the higher dollar fish. A tuna fish might sell for $15,000 for a single fish. So it makes better sense for them to go out with these poles and lines as opposed to casting huge nets trying to find them because they're not as concentrated in the ocean. And again, this is a much more environmentally friendly method because we're reducing our bycatch down to almost nothing at this point. Now, other ways to make fishing more sustainable. We can come up with size limits, closed season, and quota systems. The size limits will ensure we always have a breeding population available to us. So they don't want to be too big or too small. Too big means those are the big breeders that keep in the population. Too small, that's the babies that haven't matured yet. So you're keeping that viable breeding population alive and allowing them to mature. You're only catching them within a certain size requirement. Closed seasons allow for reproduction and replenishment of the fish populations. That's the same thing with quotas. This is ensuring that we don't have over-harvesting with it. And again, these can be at the international level or just at the local level. The problem with local level ones is if I'm, say, the coast of the United States here, and we put these restrictions in place, but I'm out, 15 miles offshore. Those are international waters. The United States has no say then on what happens out there. So the United States vessels have to abide by those rules, but say that there's a Russian vessel up in Alaska, or there's a Canadian vessel in the Atlantic Ocean. Those countries don't have to abide by the United States laws. That's why we need to turn to more international agreements. And even that is challenging because out in international waters, there's no policing body. So it's up to the individual countries to enforce those international agreements. One of the best way is to allow those quotas to be transferable, where if I don't catch enough fish for the year, I can transfer what I have left over to another fisherman and they can catch more. That way you can still have maximized profits and people making more money because they're able to transfer the quotas and catch more fish using that. In addition, say that I want to have a better year, I can go out and buy other people's quotas and they can transfer those to me before the season even starts. All right. Now, when we did that graph, we said fish production is fairly well stagnated. That's that wild caught variety. We don't have an increasing demand for fish. We're having a fairly stagnant demand, but we're having more and more aquaculture coming about. And aquaculture is human raising fish. So we're using big net pens and putting fish out into the ocean, starting to grow those fish by feeding them, sort of like a CAFO, but only an aquatic CAFO. But it does create environmental problems. When we look at the environmental problems associated with them, these are what aquatic fish farms look like. So these would both be methods of aquaculture. This one here could be inland, where we have it in a big pond system, and we keep those fish within the pond. Then we also have the ones that are out in the ocean. The problem with it is we're trying to get these fish to grow as fast as we can. So just like on land with the cows and the pigs and the chickens, we're feeding them constantly. So by feeding them constantly, we're having excess food go into the water. So we have problems with excess food and also huge quantities of waste. So high or large quantities of waste. And by waste, I mean, again, the unused food, the excess food, as well as the feces from the fish. Fish are going to be pooping constantly. If you've ever had a fish tank, you know you need to clean them out, almost every month to get that uh, poop out of the fish tank and the extra food out of the fish tank. If not, your nutrient levels get too high and algae starts to grow. Same thing happens with aquaculture. As I have that increased amount of food and poop, the nutrients around these fish pens start to increase, and we start to see algal blooms happening around them. So the water will start to get that greenish tint as the algae and the phytoplankton start to increase. Algae and phytoplankton have a very low lifespan, or very short lifespan rather. So as they start to grow, because the nutrient levels are increasing, some of those algae start to die off within a few days. As they die off, the bacteria start to decompose them, and in order for the bacteria to decompose, they need to consume oxygen. So not only do we have algae forming, we also have reduced oxygen supplies. And anytime we have reduced oxygen supplies, that's going to take these fish out of their optimal range of tolerance, and it's going to put stresses on them. Once they're outside that optimal range of tolerance, they stop growing as quickly. So a lot of times to combat that problem, they'll find some way to move these pens or to circulate the water better. What that does then is it creates problems for the native fish populations. If I'm a fish that normally lives in this area, now all of a sudden I have increased algal content, lower oxygen levels, I'm not going to be able to survive that very much. Even if they move these pens away, it's going to take a little bit of time for that algae to dissipate because those nutrients are still going to be within that water. Uh, so nutrient problems, big problem with aquaculture. Second problem is if something happens to this net and a fish escapes, or several of the fish escape, now I can have those fish become an invasive species by reproducing faster than what the native populations do. Most of these fish, again, they're designed and grown to be as fast growing as possible. So when we look at them, they're not normally found there. We might have salmon pens, for instance, out in the ocean, but salmon aren't naturally found in that area. If they would happen to escape, now those salmon start to outcompete the native fish for their food, oxygen, resources, things like that. They then increase in size, native fish populations go down, and I start having those fishery collapses as a result of that. So there's problems with aquaculture, and we have to be really careful not to have problems with that. Last big problem with it are parasites. If a fish here gets caught up with a parasite and the parasite starts to attack that fish, it can spread very quickly. As the parasite lays eggs, now it can start spreading that parasite to other fish. Sea lice are one of the big parasites that we have problems with. Those sea lice can start to attach to the sides of the fish. They start to extract nutrients from the fish is weaker, etc. The fish eventually dies. That sea lice can spread to the entire population of fish in a relatively short period of time. Because just like a CAFO, they're slammed in there and so close together. In addition to that, since most of these are grown in nets, those sea lice can escape and go out into the wild populations and start affecting the wild populations as well. All right, I'm going to stop this one here. That's on fishing. And then we'll start looking at industrial farming methods with our next video.